Zimbabwe's opposition leader Nelson Chamisa is calling on the international community to intervene in human rights violations in the country. This week, 3 women who had been picketing in Harare were allegedly abducted by police officers. The trio, who are MDC members, say they were tortured and sexually assaulted before being released. They are recovering in hospital. MDC leader Nelson Chamisa says the incident shows that Zimbabwe's government hasn't changed. Chamisa insists that it continues to victimize, to abuse and violate those viewed as enemies of the ruling regime. The government denies that police abducted the 3 women, but it says from initial reports, the trio violated lockdown regulations by picketing. Through a press release, the government said it would investigate the abduction of the women and establish who was responsible for the act. Dewa Mavhinga is the Southern African Director with the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. He joins us now via Skype from London. Mr. Mavhinga, a very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you so much, Simpiwe. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
It certainly isn't the first time that we hear reports of the torture of Zimbabwean civilians, ostensibly at the hands of police. So what's your reaction to the latest reports?
Well, it's vile, it's pure evil. And there is an indication of state involvement because these 3 young women were arrested by the police at a police roadblock and taken to Harare Central Police Station. And the police national spokesperson confirmed their arrest. It was from a police custody arrangement that they were abducted and taken away to be sexually assaulted and tortured. It's something that should be condemned, and it's not true, it's not fair that we now have so many abductions and cases of torture over the last year in Zimbabwe with not a single arrest, Simpiwe, not a single arrest, no investigations. The state is covering up. This is state-sponsored violence.
Well, Mr. Mavhinga, the accusations of torture and sexually assault are still yet to be tested. But then the government denies that police abducted the 3 women, but then only arrested them ostensibly for violating the lockdown regulations. Do you think that we're justified in using that as a defense?
The government is not justified in using that as a defense, number one. Number two, if the police arrested these 3 young women, how come they were taken out of police custody and driven some 80 kilometers from Harare, where they were abused, beaten up, sexually abused, and made to eat human waste? What kind of punishment is that? No human being deserves such crude and vile treatment for whatever crime. If they committed a crime, then the law must check its course. But there is no law that gives the power to state agents to abuse citizens in that manner. No.
Was the picket legal, though?
Well, it's not clear. People have a right in terms of the Constitution of Zimbabwe to protest. So in terms of whether or not it was legal, it's for the court to determine, but the right is there. But what I was saying is that even if it was not legal, that is not a justification for such brutal, horrific and horrendous acts on young women, sexual abuse. This is crossing the line, Simpiwe. These are crimes against humanity. And the international community must urgently step in. The UN must speak out and condemn these acts. Zimbabwe claims to be a new dispensation now in terms of government. But what is happening is far worse than what the abuses that we witnessed under Mugabe. This is unacceptable. And the international community is watching and should condemn.
Now, in cases where the court has found the police to be on the wrong side of the law, from what you've observed, is there a culture of accountability within the police force, within the government sector, in cases where police have been found to be on the wrong side of the law in terms of prosecution of these police officers?
Well, Simpiwe, no accountability at all. The culture that is there in Zimbabwe is a culture of impunity on the part of security forces, including the army and the police. You may be aware that there was a case in which the police and soldiers were accused of shooting with live ammunition and killing 6 people on the 1st of August 2018 in a protest in Harare, a post-election protest. And there was a commission of inquiry led by former South African President Kgalema Motlanthe, which found that there has been wrongdoing, but there was no accountability whatsoever. In the Constitution of Zimbabwe, there is a section 210, which says there must be an independent complaints mechanism for abuses by the security forces, including the police and the army. But that mechanism was never established. That is the only mechanism that could hold accountable members of the security forces in Zimbabwe. So the refusal by the authorities to set up that mechanism is an indication that there is no commitment to accountability, but rather to impunity.
So what do you suggest that should happen in terms of making sure that the government is held to account for the violation of the human rights of its citizens? Because clearly the efforts of the opposition movement in Zimbabwe are not working to coerce the government to uphold fundamental human rights.
Well, here is where the international community should step in. The South African leadership included should press Zimbabwe to open up for an international investigation, which is independent. UN special procedures should step in and make sure that there is accountability and that the government of Zimbabwe establishes that independent complaints mechanism to receive complaints from the security forces. These abuses can only stop if the international community comes together and says enough is enough. International crimes cannot be tolerated, and those responsible must be held accountable.
You've just mentioned South Africa, and we know South Africa's position on Zimbabwe is on whatever matter of interest in that country. So as South Africa being the chair of the African Union, what sort of mechanism can be applied to ensure that South Africa takes the issue of Zimbabwe quite seriously?
Well, representations should be made, including by the opposition and local civil society in Zimbabwe, to South Africa as the chair of the African Union, and also to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, with a clear request for intervention and for a special envoy to be dispatched immediately to Zimbabwe to stop the carnage, to stop the torture, the sexual abuse, and these crimes, and to open up for proper investigations, so that soldiers and the police involved should and must be punished, to send a clear message that this is no longer business as usual. It's not allowed. Human rights should be upheld, and security forces are not above the law.
When you talk of the international community, who are you referring to in particular, seeing that most of these international, or rather these superpowers have turned their backs on Zimbabwe? The EU, for instance, has renewed its embargo on Zimbabwe. Which countries in particular do you think would have the necessary gravitas of taking action on Zimbabwean authorities?
Well, we are talking to all members of the international community who care about human rights within the UN. We are also talking to the EU, and we have noticed that even the EU delegation in Zimbabwe, the US Embassy in Zimbabwe, the UK Embassy in Zimbabwe are speaking out and condemning these acts and demanding independent, impartial investigations. But we're saying they must do more now, because this is very clear that Zimbabwe has crossed the line, that Zimbabwe is not willing to respect human rights, and that there must be someone who must step in to protect citizens and ensure that there is respect for human rights in Zimbabwe. The opposition in Zimbabwe is a democratic opposition. It is an opposition that can only protest and do no more. And therefore, the international community collectively should step in to support values of human dignity, of Ubuntu, values that say no one would want to have their mother, their sister, their partners violated in the way that these three young MDC women were violated. For what reason? Only for protesting. They had to go through these horrific acts of abuse. It's not acceptable. It's not of this world, and it should be punished.
And in terms of enabling an inclusive dialogue and accelerating progress on reforms, what kind of role can these countries play then?
Well, these countries should push for dialogue, should offer to facilitate or to mediate. You remember, Simpiwe, that previously, in 2007, it was South Africa, under the then leader, Thabo Mbeki, that mediated in Zimbabwe, leading to some reforms and to a government of national unity that began in 2009. So we need an arrangement like that where the international community, the actors, offer to support, to mediate, and to have impartial actors who bring the parties together. Because we know that the government of Zimbabwe on its own has no appetite for reforms and has not been sincere about its promises for reforms, its promises to respect human rights and to uphold the rule of law. What we see happening now in Zimbabwe is a clear confirmation that Zimbabwe is no longer committed to human rights respect. It has become a rogue state that needs the strong words from the international community and an intervention to bring the parties together and to forge a way forward that includes respect for human rights.
Dewa Mavhinga, the Southern Africa Director with the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch, joining us from London. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Simpiwe. Thank you.